Chapter 12. Jarl Corby. The sharp and knowing eye of Jarl Corby came to rest on Robbie, and nervously he said, "It's about Finn Learson, the stranger that came ashore the night the Bergen was wrecked. I know something about him. Something that makes him a danger to my folks." "Indeed," Jarl Corby remarked. "And why mention this to me?" "Because nobody else will believe me," said Robbie, holding hard to his courage. "But you might. And then you might help me." Jarl Corby stared so hard at this that Robbie flushed scarlet. "What kind of help would you want from me?" he inquired. "The kind that folks say you can give," Robbie stammered. Then wished the words unspoken again, because Jarl Corby had smiled to hear them, and his smile was not a pleasant one. "Be careful," it warned, and there was warning too in Jarl Corby's voice as he said, "We will talk of that once you have said what you have to say." Robbie took a deep breath. The worst Jarl Corby could do would be to laugh at his story, he reminded himself. Then quickly, before he could change his mind on this, he blurted out, "Finn Learson is the great Selkie." Not a flicker of surprise crossed Jarl Corby's face. "I know that," he said so calmly that Robbie could hardly grasp what he had heard. "So you believe me?" he asked stupidly, and Jarl Corby gave a patient sigh. "Of course," he answered. "It happens that I know a lot more about the great Selkie than you do, but I should still like to hear how you guessed about him." Robbie felt his heart give a great bound of excitement. "I noticed things about him," he began, and raced straight on with the rest of his story. Jarl Corby listened in dead silence, his beaky face intent, his sharp eyes never leaving Robbie's face. He sat quite still too, and even after Robbie had finished speaking, it was only his eyes that shifted position. The sight of him like this began to make Robbie feel even more nervous than he had been at first, and finally he could stand it no longer. "How did you know that Finn Learson is the great Selkie?" he dared to ask. The sharp and knowing gaze flashed back to himself. "Because he told me," Jarl Corby answered. "He told everyone when he gave his name as Finn Learson, although I was the only one with the wit to see it." "I still don't see it," Robbie confessed, and grimly Jarl Corby told him, "You will in a moment. Say his name aloud. Say it slowly." Robbie hesitated, feeling even more puzzled by this command. Then obediently he recited the name Finn Learson, dragging out the sound as if each part of it was a separate word. "Exactly," Jarl Corby exclaimed. "Finn Lear's son. That is the proper sound of the name, for the great Selkie is the son of the sea god Lear. As for Finn, that is simply an old word for magician. And so, there you have the full measure of the bold way that name told everyone exactly who he is. The magician, who is also Lear's son. The great Selkie." Robbie felt a chill in the very marrow of his bones. The magician, he thought. And once again in his mind's eye, he saw Finn Learson melting like a shadow from the press gang's hands, skimming the ground like a creature flying. Then further back still in his mind went, to the dream of Finn Learson staring Tam into frightened silence. Tam had sensed the truth from the very beginning, he told himself then, and that was why Finn Learson had needed to get the creature into his power. If only they had all paid more attention to Tam's warning growls that night. But maybe it was not yet too late. With hope beginning to warm him a little, Robbie waited impatiently for Jarl Corby to speak again, But the schoolmaster was also thinking his own thoughts, and his mind seemed to have drifted far from the present moment. He had picked up a knife from his desk, Robbie noticed. A long knife with a thin, sharp blade that glittered in the candlelight. With his fingers stroking this blade, he sat for a while longer, staring at nothing in particular. But at last he did look at Robbie again. "It has happened before," he said then. And this was so exactly an echo of old Daw's dying words that Robbie felt himself gasping. "There was another time when a stranger came ashore to this island, and the story was that he persuaded a girl to marry him. But he was not a man at all, of course, and he was not young, as he seemed to be. He was the old one, the cunning one, the magician who was also the great Selkie. And so, of course, he had a different name that time. Aegir's son, he called himself then. Aegir being another name for the god of the sea. And the girl who married this stranger, Aegir's son, was never seen alive again." Jarl Corby's gaze went back to the knife. His fingers returned to stroking the shining blade. Almost as if talking to himself, he said, "The girl was young, a bonny girl with golden hair. Her name was Anne." There was a silence. The blade glittered. Jarl Corby's fingers moved steadily back and forth along its length. "Is that the end of the story?" Robbie ventured at last. Jarl Corby looked up. "Not quite," he answered. "There was a young man of the islands this girl would have married, and after she was stolen away, he shipped aboard a whaler. To earn money, he said, but his real purpose was to search for the great Selkie and to kill him. The whaler sailed north, and there, on the coast of Greenland, the man found the great Selkie in his natural form of a great bull seal. The man drew a knife and struck out with a blow that was meant to kill, and although he did not succeed in this, he managed to at least give the great Selkie a sorely wounded shoulder. Once, on the shores of Greenland, I was hunted by a man who came at me with a knife to kill me. See, I carry the mark of his knife to this very day, and this long white scar of the healed wound on my shoulder." The echo of Finlayson's voice sounded in Robbie's mind, and once again he saw Finlayson turning a smooth brown shoulder to show the mark of a long knife wound. "How do you know about all this?" he asked curiously, and was astonished to see Jarl Corby rise to his feet, his face suddenly all twisted with rage. The hand holding the knife went up as if to strike, and Robbie shrank back in alarm. But the blow was not intended for him. "Because this is the knife that made the wound," Jarl Corby said harshly. The upraised arm brought the knife down hard towards the desk, and as the point stabbed into the wound, he added, "And I am the man who struck the blow." Robbie stared at the blade quivering in the wood. It was hard to imagine Jarl Corby as a young man, he thought, and even harder to imagine him as a jealous young man in love of a golden-haired girl. But there was one thing at least he could grasp in all this, and surely that was the very thing that mattered now. Triumphantly, Robbie spoke his thoughts out loud. "You hated the great Selkie. You still hate him." Jarl Corby leaned forward, glaring. "I know what's in your mind," he snapped. "You think that's reason enough for me to help you now, but you're wrong. I know the things they say of me here in Black Ness, and I am not going to give them cause to say more." "But no one would know," Robbie pleaded. "Not from me, at least. And what's to become of Elspeth if you don't help? She'll be like the other girl, Anne, and that will be your fault." Jarl Corby frowned at this, until his eyebrows almost met above his beaky nose. Then he clasped his hands behind his back and began striding up and down, his tattered black gown flapping with every step. He looked more like a big, ungainly raven than ever, thought Robbie, and felt the same old dread seizing him again. There was no way of going back on what he had done, however, and he was impatient now, as well as afraid. Biting his lip, he watched the tall, striding figure, and at last Jarl Corby said, "I was young and foolish when I went after the great Selkie with a knife, but I am old enough and wise enough now to know that he cannot be killed with any mortal weapon. He cannot be defeated either, not when he has his natural form of a Selkie at least. But there is one way of making sure he can do no harm while he has a man's shape. One way only." Jarl Corby halted in his stride and shot one of his knowing looks at Robbie. "I cannot see any hope of you carrying that out," he went on. "But nevertheless, you might as well know something about it, which means that you must first of all discover where he hid his Selkie skin when he shed it to come ashore. If you do that, you will have a hold over him that could bend him to your will. For without that skin, he cannot return to his kingdom under the sea." Robbie stood staring at Jarl Corby, his heart racing suddenly so fast that he could hardly speak. "But," he managed, "but I—" Jarl Corby held a hand. "I know," he said. "The search for it would be a hopeless one. There are so many places around the coast of the Vaud where it could be. So many caves." "But I know where it is," interrupted Robbie, shouting. "I know." And still breathing hard, he rushed on to tell Jarl Corby about the cave in the Yo, where he had gone to count the Selkie pups. "So you see," he finished triumphantly, "it must be hidden there, or Finleirson would not have bothered to keep me in sight from the cliff tops that day. He only did that because he was afraid I would go into the cave and find the skin. And that was what he meant when he said he had a feeling I might get into trouble in the Yo." A wicked gleam came into Jarl Corby's eyes, making them sharper and brighter than ever. With one long hand stroking his chin, he murmured, "You could be right, boy. A cave like that, so handy for reaching black nests, and yet so well hidden from the houses there, would be a perfect lurking place for him. He could shed his skin and take human form quite safely there, when the time came for him to do so. And from there also, he would find it easy enough to swim ashore as if he had just come from a wreck." "Of course," Robbie agreed eagerly. "And the chance came when the Bergen was wrecked with all hands drowned, so that there was nobody left to say he was not a survivor. Moreover, he knew he would need money of some kind on the island, and the cave would give him somewhere to store his gold, all ready to take ashore with him." Yes, that could be the way of it," Jarl Corby nodded. "Gold from the treasure ships sunk around this island was something he could dive for at any time, but he still needed somewhere to keep it in the readiness. And as for the trousers and the money belt he wore that night, they would have been only too easy to acquire. What with so many poor drowned sailor-men floating in the Vaud then." Robbie felt a cold shiver at the picture this brought into his mind, but he still pressed on with the rest of what he had to say. "There's one last thing," he told Jarl Corby. "When Finleirson pulled me out of the water that day, he told me, 'It's high time you learned to leave the deep waters to those who can swim in them.' And he warned me to keep out of the Yo in future." "Did he indeed?" Jarl Corby explained. "Well, that proves it, boy. The skin must be in the cave, and we had better lay hands on it soon. This very night, in fact, or we may lose the chance it gives us for getting a hold over Finleirson." "We?" Robbie asked uncertainly, and Jarl Corby looked suddenly taken aback. "Well," he began. Then he walked away from Robbie and stood looking at the knife in the desk. One hand went out to pull it free, and he turned to Robbie again, with the wicked gleam once more lighting his eyes. "Yes, we," he said softly, "because I never thought I would live to be revenged on the great Selkie, and revenge is very sweet. But mark this, Robbie Henderson, it will take magic to defeat the great Selkie's magic, and you know what our minister is like. You heard the way he raged against superstition on the day of your old Da's funeral. And so what do you think he would do if he heard I was indeed practicing the unholy arts that people say I do practice? One word, one hint of that, and he would seize on it to have me banished from the island, or jailed, or maybe something even worse." "He'll learn nothing from me," Robbie said earnestly. "Nobody will." "That had better be a promise," Jarl Corby assured him, "or I will be revenged on you also. Now get off home, and be down at the Vaux at midnight, and we will go together to find that skin."